So we're going to talk about not every app needs to be a single-page app. If you know anything about me, this is not a new topic. I've talked about this before. We're going to show you some progress, where we're going, where we're heading. So I'm Rob Wormald, if you don't know me. I'm a DPE on the Angular team. I also started the NGRX project. I don't do anything with the NGRX project, so keep your questions going to Mike and Brandon about that. I also do a lot of the web standards for Angular, and we'll talk about some of that as we get into this talk. So in the keynote this morning, there was this really great graph from Igor. And it talks a little bit about how he thinks, how I think about how apps are built, what are the tools we use, what are the categories we can put them in. And so he talked about the history of Angular. Right? We kind of started here at the small, medium apps, the prototyping stuff. As Angular evolved, right, Angular 2 was kind of designed to do the much bigger enterprise apps case. As he said, we didn't quite get there, but over the past couple of years, we've improved that much, much more. Right? So I'm going to talk about the two other ends of the spectrum here. We're going to start at the skinny end on the right side, scaling down. Right? And he mentioned that in the talk this morning. So what's happening here at the end, right? Small, medium apps, demos, things that are not these gigantic enterprise applications that you may or may not need everything that Angular provides. And so I've been working on this project that really kind of to start investigating this really narrow end of the spectrum, right? So this is Angular Elements. Raise your hand if you're using Angular Elements today. A bunch of you, cool. That's awesome. So Angular Elements is a project that allows you to take your Angular components and publish them as web components, custom elements. And the key takeaway here is that it allows you to take an Angular component out of an app and use it in any web application on any website, if it's driven by CMS, whatever. So if you don't know about web components, you should definitely read about them. The quick definition that's important here, they're a set of web platform APIs that allow you to create new HTML tags there. I don't know where my laser pointer is, never mind. And importantly, they're built on modern browsers, modern standards, and they work in any JavaScript library or framework on the web. That's important. So why did we do this? Why did we actually start thinking about this? Well, there are a bunch of use cases that are not covered by kind of the typical things we think about with SPAs, right? And this is the other two ends of that spectrum. So the first thing is mixed environments. And this is where we started with the Elements project about a year ago. There are lots of frameworks out there, lots of web applications, lots of legacy tech, lots of new stuff coming out every week, right? Not all of you can start with greenfield projects. Often you're moving off of some old stack. It might be Angular JS. It might be something completely non-JavaScript related. And you want to be able to kind of move forward incrementally, make progress on this stuff. We've heard a lot about this case of mini applications, right? You have some kind of Angular application, many components, many parts, right? And we want to kind of project that into some other web application. An ng upgrade is actually kind of an example of this, right? Where you have some code base written in one framework, you want it to talk to the other framework, and that's kind of the concept we're talking about here. So we started here, right? And I think we've done a fairly successful job about this. Please come and tell me if we haven't, and if there are things we need to improve here. I'll put an asterisk there, because we're not quite there yet, but we're getting very close in the mixed environment stuff. Two examples that I want to call out that are in production today. So the first is Angular Elements, or sorry, Angular.io, which is our own documentation site. The reason we use Elements here is because kind of the outer content shell of the website is an Angular application. It's using all the Angular stuff you know. But the middle, the actual documentation is all written in Markdown. And we want to be able to enable and embed these little widgets of interactive functionality. So this page here, the tabs there, they're interactive. They're a real little Angular component. But we don't want people, mainly our doc authors, to have to write code to start these things up, right? So all you got to do is put that element on the page, and when the Markdown comes up and gets rendered, that element will start up and kind of work straight away. The other interesting case that I think not a lot of people know about, but I think is just awesome, is Capital One. Capital One is using Angular Elements to do upgrades. So they have an Angular JS application, and they're using Elements to actually start to begin to project parts of Angular into this application. So this is in production today. This is really cool. This is the thing that we didn't actually really think about from the beginning. It turns out this is a really cool case, and I think this is something we'll continue to look into, using Elements for upgrade. But not everything is great, right? We can't do everything we want to do yet. I've already heard from about 100 people in the 24 hours I've been here. There's a bunch of use cases you want us to cover. The big one is, for me, is this idea of enhancing existing HTML pages, things that come off of a CMS. The problem with this is that Angular typically owns the whole page, right? You ship an empty page. There's kind of one root component there. And what you really want to be able to do is have developers who are maybe not developers, maybe not JavaScript developers, your designers, be able to assemble pages out of existing components. You want to be able to use that with any kind of back-end stack, right? It's possible today, but honestly, it's really, really complicated to do this. It's not easy. The other one, and this one I think is really, really interesting, especially for a lot of people in this room, is design systems, right? We've heard a lot of feedback from people who would really like to be able to use Angular to build these common UI libraries that we talk about all the time, right? But use them across their entire organization, not just in their Angular apps, in their React apps, in their Preact apps, in their Ember apps. And we want to make sure that works as well. But this is not easy, right? Why isn't this easy? Why couldn't we do this from day one? Well, a lot of this is because Angular was designed, as that chart showed you, right, to really be thought about from the single-page application case. And I'm highlighting the word app here because an app, to me, is larger than just a component. You might have services, you have data. There's a lot more than just a component in an app. The other stuff is that Angular, again, was designed for this, as Minko mentioned previously. We want to have all that code up front, right, so that it can fast, it feels interactive very quickly, you're not waiting for all this stuff. But the trade-off is, if you load all this code up front, it makes the case of taking some widget and putting it into another application a lot less viable, right? If you have to ship 300K of Angular to boot up a hello world, that's not a great experience. The other thing, and I think this is probably the most important, is that there's a lot of knowledge required to do this, right? You want to think about just a component, but actually you have to think about an app and modules and platforms and all this stuff, right? And so there's a really level of friction there that we want to get rid of. So let's kind of look at a simple example. So this is your basic kind of hello world Angular component, right? It's got some inputs, some outputs, has some event handling. This is nice and simple, right? But really what it is you got an ng module that you got to think about kind of separately from the component. You got to tell the ng module about the component. You also got to tell the ng module about all the things you need to use, like the platform and the common modules and all this stuff, right? And then, once you've got your module and your component, you've got to go to another file, boot up the platform, boot up your module, get a hold of the injector, finally hand the injector the element, right? And then finally, you can give that element to the browser, and it'll kind of boot up and work from there. Now again, lots of people are doing this. This is useful, especially if you're already in an Angular application where this is kind of already happening. But it's a lot of overhead if you've not done this before. It's really quite complicated. So this is the thing I think everybody's been waiting for, everybody's been asking me about, so we'll talk about this first. What is Elements going to look like with Ivy? What does Ivy let us do? How does it let us change how we think about elements? And the answer is a lot. So let's go through this example again. Simple Angular component again, right? The same component. I've just omitted the template to keep my slides from running over. And in Ivy, this is the simplest Angular application you can write. You have a component, you import the render component method, you call, the function, and you call render component with a hello world, and that's it, right? This, elements aside, I think is a huge improvement in thinking about applications versus components. Ivy makes this really, really easy. And I want to show you how easy by actually kind of building out what elements looks like with you on stage here. Because it's really not that complicated. It's a very powerful thing. But it only takes like 50 lines of code. So we'll start from that example again, right? Simple empty file here. We've got our hello world component we just looked at. And we're bringing in that render component method from the Angular core. So that render component method can actually take some additional options. And the first one you can give it is a host element. So in this case, rather than Angular going and looking for the element we want to connect our component to, we're going to actually go and query for that element first, and then tell Angular explicitly, put this component onto this element, right? So this is kind of like the first step towards the dynamic behavior. Let's turn this into a custom element, right? So we'll go ahead and put our base custom element implementation in here. That thing extends from the HTML element, as all custom elements do. We're just going to tell the browser about it. So what do we want to happen here? What we want is when we create a new instance of this constructor, or this component, when the browser creates it, when a developer creates it, we want to actually go ahead and boot up Angular, right? So this is really easy. What we're going to do is just inside of the constructor of our custom element, take that same render component method, call it, pass it the component, and instead of going and querying for an element, because we're inside of a web component here, we already have the element. We are the element. So we can just pass the this. And in the simplest, like this is Ivy elements. This is all it really takes to make it work. Expanding that a little bit, obviously you want properties, right? So our hello world component had an input of the name, so you could render it to the template. We'll implement this manually here. We're just going to put a setter and a getter onto our component or onto our element class. And basically, when a value gets set from the outside world to that name property, we will go ahead and take it, assign it to the component's name property, and then call detect changes on it. The other thing to notice here is I'm calling detect changes, and I've just imported that from Angular. It's just a function. I don't have to inject a change detector ref here. I don't have to have DI to get a hold of that, right? I just have a function I can call with the component that I want change detection to run. So it makes it really easy to implement that. And then we want attributes to work, right? So this is kind of baked into the web platform. We just tell the browser, look, we want you to watch the name attribute on the element. And when that changes, call the attribute changed callback. We'll get the new value of the attribute. We'll just set it to our setter, which we defined previously. That will then set it to the component and trigger change detection to happen. So like almost by default, this is zoneless, right? This doesn't require zones to work. It's very much an on-push model. When the data changes, we'll go ahead and trigger change detection for you. So obviously, we don't have you to write all of that stuff, right? You shouldn't have to do it every time. So this will likely look something like this. So you can see at the top there from Angular Elements, we're bringing in effectively a mix-in. This is a base class that provides all of that stuff that I just built for you kind of manually, right? And all you got to do is say, here's my component. Give me back the custom element. Note, like, there's no platforms here. There's no modules here. I'm literally just one line of code, take my component, turn it into a custom element, register it with the browser. And that's literally it. So we think that's a pretty big step forward. So far, so good. Of course, if you're doing something today with Angular Elements, you're probably using the injector. You're probably using DI. You're probably using all the cool stuff that Angular provides to you. So of course, you can still do that. You just pass the injector as the second parameter. That works exactly the same as it does in the current API, and everything kind of works as normal. How you get a hold of that injector is up to you. You could do exactly the same steps that I showed you previously. You might do it from your own custom component. Whatever you want to do, you have the ability to do it this way. That makes sense so far? Yeah? Cool. This is a thing you can do today, but not a lot of people know about, right? So actually, it's the same exact function there. So we're calling that with component. It's returning back a custom element class for us. And we're extending from it. So this is useful if I wanted to do something else when the thing gets connected to the DOM or when it gets removed from the page. I can just go ahead and jump and use the standard custom element callbacks here, do something, and then call that super connected callback and kind of hand control back to Angular. Right? So this gives it a very, very simple API to start with, but a very, very extensible API as you want to do more and more complicated things. So the reality here is that we're still talking about modules. I haven't really showed you them, right? But they are still part of this equation here. And really today in Ivy land, there are kind of two primary things that an ng module is going to do for you, right? The first is the declarations array there. And the declarations array basically just tells Angular's compiler, take this component, run it through the compiler, do all the template stuff, and give me back a compiled component. And the second there is imports. And imports, we could do a whole talk about ng modules. The point here is that all I'm expressing here is that I would like to be able to use the things that are in the common module inside of my template for the hello world component, right? So all we're saying is here's some stuff that I want to be able to use in my hello world component. So this is great. It's much simpler, right? But again, it's still kind of this abstract thing that isn't really exactly your component. You kind of have to think about it differently. And so we'll get to this. But keep this in mind as we go through the next steps here. One nice thing about Ivy is that actually declarations technically are not required, right? The problem, though, is if you don't put something in ng module, you have no way to express to the component which directives you want to use, which pipes you want to use, right? Because again, today, that ng module provides you the place where all those selectors are available. So this is a thing that we kind of went, oh, this is not great. And this is one of the blocking issues that we have at the moment that we're kind of working through. So what I'm going to show you is one idea at how we're going to handle this. I think Misha is going to talk more about these ideas on Friday. So don't freak out when I show you this, but it should look familiar to you. It shouldn't look that scary. And I just want to kind of show how we're thinking about this problem. And when you see this, come and talk to me after the talk and tell me how you feel about it. I'd love to know how it makes you feel. If it works, if it looks scary, we can go from there. So how do we do this? Well, we already do this with providers, right? Not many people know this. Not many people use this API. But you can provide providers directly to a component, right? And every time that component fires up, you'll get an instance of that provider, that service, and everything kind of works as normal. So what if, and this is a what if, warning you, what if we went back to what we did back in the RC4 days? Who was using Angular in RC4? Claps? You can clap for this. I clap for this, right? Number one, we're sorry about the RC again, right? But now that we get back to this day, I go, well, actually, maybe this wasn't such a terrible idea, right? So again, to me, there's some trade-offs here. Number one, like, it could become more verbose. You may have to bring in more things, right? The other hand, though, it's much simpler. It's much more direct. Yes, I'm using this pipe, this directive in this component. It's all very kind of in one file here. Again, tell me how you feel about this after the talk. We'll take your feedback from there. So this one, look a little more closely and kind of see if you can check out the difference between these two things that I'm flipping between. There are two things that are changing, OK? The first one is I'm taking the component decorator from Angular, and I'm turning it into an ng element. And the second thing that I'm doing, if you look at the class, Angular components, right, are just POJOs. They're just classes. They don't extend from anything. There's no base class. But in this case, I'm taking my component, and I'm extending it with that same ng element mix-in that I was using earlier. And so what this actually gives me is an Angular element without an Angular component. So I have an Angular element, like web component, and a template, right, and context and all of these things, but I have no component, no separate thing. Now, we've always talked about Angular elements in terms of taking Angular components and publishing them. But there are a lot of cases, especially if you're building a design system, if you're building something that's really lightweight, you may not actually need the Angular component model. You might want an Angular template, right, and all the great things that I'm falling off my little step here. All of the things that Angular templates give you without the Angular component model. So this is one kind of speculative idea. And the idea here is, again, like you already know how a component works. You know how a decorator works. So this translates fairly simply for most people to the custom element kind of idea. And again, all of this is taking away some of the indirection and giving you that full control if you wish to have it. This one is the thing that somebody suggested to me that I had not considered at all, but I think is a fantastic idea. And it actually informed how I started thinking about the first 10 months API. So that a lot of cases today, and in many, many web applications, you may use something like D3 or any of the great charting libraries, right? There are a number of other ways to render data to DOM than just Angular templating, right? So in this case, wouldn't it be nice if you could use Angular's mechanics, our CLI, the concepts you already know, and package that up into something that everybody else can use? So in this case, we're creating an Angular element, right, but using D3 to do the rendering. So effectively, what this is giving you is change detection without Angular templating. So this allows you to create usable components in the Angular ecosystem that work with Angular, of course, work on all the other applications, of course, and you're not paying the cost of the Angular templating, which you're not using here. So again, these are just layered APIs. You'll be able to use any kind of levels of these different things. The with ng component that we looked at the beginning is the kind of simplest API. This is the lowest level API, and we want you to be able to pick and choose where you go. Cool. So that's kind of the entry point to the beginning. And I talk about the sort of narrow, low-level entry point because it actually enables us to do some really interesting things at the other end of the spectrum. So if you were paying attention in the keynote this morning, you may have seen that word Angular Photon go by. I know some of you did, because I've had like 50 tweets already this morning asking me, what the hell is Angular Photon? So what is Photon? Photon is a research project. And I want to be clear about this, right? Photon is not yet a product. It's not a thing that we're guaranteeing to ship. It's more of a working group of coming up with kind of the next generation tooling, next generation concepts for Angular developers, right? So again, Photon is not a thing we're going to ship next week. It's an idea that we're working through. And if we decide that it becomes a product like Gatsby or Next, that may be the way we go with it. We may use it and just roll some of the ideas back into the core of Angular. We don't know the way it's going to go yet, but we want to kind of talk to you about how we're thinking about this problem. So why? There are two big reasons, I think. The first one is that little umbrella on the side there, that's Google Shopping Express. So that's an Angular project. It's a big e-commerce platform from Google. It's an awesome project. It's written in Angular. And quite frankly, this is probably the most challenging project I've ever been around, right? This was the first team that we really spoke to who wanted to do all of the things that we've talked about long before we designed how to do them, right? So we made it work. And actually, it's very, very cool. We use a bunch of SSR. We use custom elements. There's a bunch of really interesting things we're doing here. And we want to make sure that all that stuff that we had to build in a really difficult way for the GSX team works for everybody else really simply. The second, and this got mentioned again this morning, is that we have this new sister team, Wiz. And Wiz, they're great at all of this stuff, right? This is the thing that they've been doing for 10 years. So they have a bunch of really interesting knowledge, concepts, ideas that we had no concept of at all. And we looked at this stuff and went, oh, wow, this makes a lot of sense for a lot of our Angular developers. Can we learn from some of these concepts? Can we think about baking them into the Angular that you use today? So what do we want to do? How do we want to do this, right? What are we kind of looking at? What is this shaping up to be? Well, the first is that pre-rendering and SSR are almost certainly going to be a necessity here, right? The fastest way to get content on a screen is by server-side rendering, whether that's at build time, in response to a request, based on some cron job, but pre-rendering, or that is shipping HTML already formed to the browser, it's very, very hard to do things any faster than that. So that's kind of the first thing we're looking at. The second is, and this is an idea that Wiz implemented from day one, is this idea of like a very minimal initial JS payload, right? And that is like there's a fixed cost for using their framework. It brings in some stuff to set up event listeners and some orchestration things. But you have a fixed cost, which allows the rest of the application to boot up. But it means that you're not blocking and waiting for megabytes of script to load before the user is able to use the app. This is, again, based on that kind of elements idea here, but loading components only when needed. And Minko, again, talked about this in the previous talk. But this is the idea that like, you shouldn't have to actually bring along a component until it's either used or interacted with or necessary to do rendering, right? Again, this is possible in Angular today. It's complicated. But we've got some ideas that actually really make this really, really powerful and straightforward. So this includes progressive bootstrapping, right? We want to send HTML to the browser fully formed. And then as you interact with the page, as you navigate, bring in the code necessary to make that work. So really, in general, and this is a thing that may not make sense to too many people in the open source world, but really we want the ease of Angular, all the stuff that you and open source love, and the speed and the guarantees that Wiz gives our internal customers, right? So the two of these things together, we don't know what it looks like yet, but Photon is the project to figure this out, right? To think about these problems. And again, it's about extending this thing that we built for Google Shopping Express, which is really awesome but really complicated, and putting it in a way that all of you can use and benefit from. Ease of use. So I've got asked about this a few times as well, so I'll put it up here and say, we've been looking a lot at tools like Next and Nuxt and Gatsby, right? These are awesome, awesome tools from the React community. We've seen a few examples of this kind of experimenting with Angular. We want to make this really, really easy. We don't know if the Angular team will build this. We expect that us or somebody will build this. But again, we want to give you the tools, the capabilities necessary to actually allow you to do this, right? Additions to Angular, so declarative data fetching comes in here. This is a thing that I don't have time to talk about, but allowing you to do data not just on a node server, and so you can use your PHP, C++, whatever you want server, and again, do this progressive bootstrapping stuff and make it work. Code splitting, Minko talked about that. It's a big part of this. And then again, linting and validation tooling to keep you on track. Automatic code splitting, I'll just show you this. This is very simple. We want to do it at a component level. Every component should be a chunk. Everything's lazy loaded. How does this look? Well, this is that Angular element we were looking at earlier, right? Here, we're bringing in the element synchronously. It's all baked together. We can change this very simply. We have a different mix-in with a lazy ng component here. We use that dynamic import syntax we talked about earlier. And the way this works is now you have this thing registered with the browser. The first time somebody uses it, the first time somebody boots one up, Angular will go and fetch the component for you, fetch all the code necessary to make that component work, and boot it up. But it allows you to define elements, use them, and then when they actually get used, bring in the code. This is pretty powerful. So I'm already out of time, I think. I'm going to say stay tuned on this. This is a thing that, again, we are deeply looking at. There's a lot of time being spent on it. If this resonates with you at all, if you have problems with this, if this is a space that you're thinking about, please come and speak to me. I'd love to hear what your struggles are, what kind of things you're looking at doing, and how what we're doing applies. The key kind of tenet of the Photon project is to make sure that we actually design something based on user feedback that is going to work for everybody, right? That allows you to be on Rails. And for us, we really need these use cases from you to make that work. I'm already out of time. That's everything for me. Thanks for listening. Again, please come and find me. Let's talk about this stuff.